Okay, welcome everybody to this Sunday's WIN meeting. Today, the theme of the meeting is the housing issue focused on Romania. And as a speaker, here we have Annika Vince, if I pronounce the name correctly. She is one of the leading persons in the Social Housing Now movement in Romania. And also she's also an academic and is taking up some of these issues in her work. We recently met, and they are doing a very important work in Romania over this issue over the last 10 years or so. So I'll leave the floor to her to introduce the issue, and then we can proceed in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Thank you for all of us, for all of you, for having me here. I just managed to read a few documents of the internationalist standpoint and also read your common statement. The common statement of internationalist standpoint and Workers' International Network that you issued in December last year. So when I read this, I became even more anxious about my potential contribution to your platform, to your agenda. I understood that you are looking for possibilities to discuss with other groups than those that are already members in a way or another in your networks. Hopefully I can add some ideas regarding how to mobilize for a socialist alternative, or more specifically, how to think about a socialist alternative to capitalism through to housing. Because I'm, as Nikos said, I'm also an intellectual, a public intellectual. I've done both academic and militant research on housing and real estate development in Romania and Central and Eastern Europe. For example, when I read this text that the Internationalist Standpoint launched in January 2022, so 2 years ago, and also some of the very quick read through the other documents of Internationalist Standpoint, I realized that the issue of housing is totally missing by now from the agenda. Nevertheless, because you invited me, I assume that you all agree that politicizing on housing is very important for looking for a socialist alternative to capitalism, but also for an internationalist organizing. Why I'm saying this very briefly? Because housing is central to any political economy, so it's very central for capitalism. Housing is a domain for capital accumulation, and also housing is a terrain on which exploitation is going on. So it's not only the labor force, which continues to be exploited in capitalism, but also people's housing needs are exploited by investors, real estate developers, institutional investors, but also maybe small owners of property, residential property, who all exploit actually people's housing needs. The fact that housing is a fundamental human need, and due to the fact that all over the globe there is a very the stock of public housing is more and more shrinking. Therefore, housing is accessible mostly to the market, which makes actually the housing needs very vulnerable to exploitation. Obviously, there are differences between countries in what regards the public housing stock. For sure, Romania and former Central and European countries, which have a state socialist legacy in their history, are actually doing worse in these matters. Their public housing stock being very much reduced in the past 3 decades. And yeah, somehow the former state socialist housing regime was a laboratory for changing it into one of the most market-dominated housing regimes in Europe. So this is one reason why we should discuss about housing when we are looking for a socialist alternative. If housing is such a core issue in capitalism, this means that we should think about how changing the housing regime can have a contribution to change the whole political economy structures. Housing as a field of production, but also as a field of social reproduction. Secondly, why is it important to speak about housing matters when somebody believes in the need and potential of international organizing? Because as we all know, global capitalism since a while, in the past 3 decades, but not only, because this phenomenon started to happen earlier, even in the late 1970s, with the principle of free movement of capital. So this affects also housing. So basically, real estate capital and financial capital, which intersects with real estate capital, actually flows everywhere freely and unregulated across borders. So therefore, you know, today it's impossible to think about changing a housing regime of a country without changing the rules which actually create these possibilities for real estate investors, for example, to freely move from one country to another and actually slowly integrate the whole globe and formerly non-capitalist territories into their sphere of interest. So and obviously this is a very difficult matter. So how to organize internationally to combat these powerful global institutional investors, landlords all over the countries. And because housing is so central to capitalism, and because struggling for another housing regime is so difficult, therefore I'm convinced personally that this should be part of a larger effort. So housing movements cannot do anything on their own. They should build partnerships or even more comradeships, or be part of larger thinking, revolutionary and organizing for a socialist alternative. So it's very important, and I guess people from former state socialist countries, including myself, can have a contribution to this endeavor also because we can bring on the table of discussions the legacy of state socialist housing regime. Obviously, the strong anti-communist attack, which is ongoing at least 3 decades, also in our countries, make us very vulnerable, I may say, when we start speaking about the positive achievements of state socialist housing regime. Obviously, we are very quickly tagged as nostalgic of Ceausescu's era. So basically, it's very hard, you know, to even open up a discussion like this and try to say that one may learn something about the state from the state socialist legacies because of this very strong anti-communist feelings and practices in our countries. Personally, a few months ago, I tried to write an analysis about the financial background of the state socialist housing regime, because I was very interested to reveal how was it possible that the socialist state could create and use substantial budget funds, money for producing 3 million housing units in 30 years or so, public housing units, I mean. So now it's not time for presenting details about that. But yeah, it's a good way to learn something, you know, from our past and to see how those financial mechanisms might be put again into practice when we think about definancializing the housing sector, for example. That's a matter which concerns very many people nowadays. Okay, so after these general matters or presenting my motivations why I think it's good to have the housing issue on the agenda of an internationalist socialist standpoint, so in the next step I want to say something about the housing crisis in Romania. When I'm using the term housing crisis, I am referring to basically the housing shortage on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the housing affordability crisis in the country, which obviously it's not a singular illustration for this phenomenon, because across Europe, across the globe, the housing affordability crisis is a huge issue. But how is it manifested in Romania, for example? I was thinking to give some figures to reflect on this. For example, if we compare the monthly cost of private rent, which, for example, in Cluj, my city, and also the capital city of Romania, Bucharest, which is these two are the most expensive cities from this point of view. Like an average cost of private rent would be around 500 euros per month, while the median income in Romania is around 950 euros. So somebody, if he earns this median income, which is very close to the average income actually, then it means that he or she pays more than 50%, more than half of their income to the rental cost. And this is characteristic, I mean, not so much in other cities, but also there are some more regional cities in the country where the rental or private rental costs are very high compared to people's income. So I'm not speaking about the minimum income, right? I'm speaking about average and median income. So in a way, this housing affordability crisis is an issue of the cities, of reurbanization of the cities in the context of capitalist transformations, of ways in which housing became a super commodity and also an object for financial investments. So basically in these big regional cities, which were somehow privileged by capital, that was attracted to these localities, which are also called magnet cities or competitive cities, which actually means that they are able, this is the World Bank discourse, which names these cities like that, or growth poles, which are able to create a friendly business environment and to attract investors, among them real estate investors. So basically, those cities who won this competition for attracting investors actually are displaying the highest degree of housing affordability crisis in the country. What do people do if they cannot pay for a home, for renting a home, or they are not eligible for mortgages, or if they are eligible but they should have paid a lot for the cost of a loan? What they do, one of the most widespread strategies is to move together. So people share apartments, students, young professionals, early career professionals, but even people with minimum income, or even if, okay, these cities are having higher average income, still there are many workers who make useful work for the city and cannot pay for these very high prices because they are exploited at their jobs. So what they do, they move together. Therefore, another phenomenon which is called overcrowdedness is very widespread in Romania, and this overcrowded rate of homes is very high. Just a look to the Eurostat statistics reflect this. While at the level of the EU, in the total population, the percentage of those who live in overcrowded homes is 17%. In Romania, is 40%. And it's a little bit higher among those who earn below the poverty threshold. Like half of those who earn or who are in risk of poverty are actually suffering of this overcrowdedness of the homes where they live. Additionally, we have other phenomena which affect mostly the most precarious and poor people who don't have in their ownership a home, who don't have relatives who have properties, and who live in informal settlements, for example, or others who are victims of evictions made by the public authorities or evictions made by the private owners. Actually, by the way, this issue of private rental, it's very difficult to even talk about it in Romania. Why? Because we lack any relevant statistics, for example, about the number of those who are living in private rental. There are some estimates, for example, made by World Bank recently, which say that in the big cities, for example, in Cluj, around 15% of people who live in the city live in private rentals, and 40% of the residential units in the larger metropolitan area are rented on the private market. But these are only estimates, so actually the legislation regarding private rental is very soft and allows the owners not to declare and not to be obliged to have a contract with the renters. Yeah, what I wanted to say with this, I guess it's that also due to this, it's very difficult even to follow, who is evicted by a private owner. Respectively, if you don't have a contract and the private owner kicks you out, you don't even call that eviction because you haven't had a legal base for staying here, for living there. So what we observed in the past 5-6 years were evictions from public housing, because we still have in Cluj, for example, a public housing stock, but very, very small, below 2% of the total housing stock is public housing. I'm not entering into details here. What does it mean? But yeah, we witnessed several evictions from some of these municipally owned residences. Actually, one of such evictions was the occasion which actually triggered the local housing movement in 2010, when there was a big mass eviction, like 350 persons Roma ethnicity were evicted from a centrally placed location in Cluj and forcibly relocated nearby the landfill of the city, where the municipality built to them as an alternative, so to speak, some so-called modular houses. So, yeah, with this, maybe I go to the third section of what I planned to present, and this is the local housing movement in Cluj, but also the housing movement in Romania. So the matter of eviction was not only triggering housing or a movement only in Cluj, but also in Bucharest. So in Cluj, we have the Căși, ACUM, Social Housing Now movement. We named it as such only in 2015, 16, but before the name occurred, which reflects that we are actually struggling for the increase of public housing, because in Romania, social housing is public housing. But before that, starting with 2010, we started to express some revolts, as I said, around and against forced evictions of Roma people. Therefore, anti-racism was very important political message for us from the very beginning. So actually, at the beginning of our mobilization, which was a mobilization of, I don't know, university professors, researchers, students from Cluj, together with the Roma people who were victims of these evictions. So the very first, as I said, political message and idea of ours was that we have to fight against institutional racism. represented by the municipality, right? But in time, we learned to approach the causes of evictions and the causes of housing crises in larger terms, and we started to analyze housing policies, how the politics of housing changed after 1990, how this resulted in the radical decrease of the public housing stock, how actually by this the state created opportunities for the capital to have more investment opportunities in housing, for example. So how the state policies actually contributed to the creation of the housing market and to the creation of the market, generally speaking, through these measures. And then especially in the past 7 years or so, so since 2015, right, which is a period of economic growth, so to speak. Maybe you heard about some figures about Romania, how spectacular economic growth the country displayed after the former financial crisis, so basically after 2015 or so. So this period of time was actually the period when real estate development became very, very strongly visible, and investors made more and more investments into not only into housing, but also in commercial real estate, and also, I don't know, shopping malls and office buildings, which actually the shopping malls and office buildings are the territory mostly occupied by international investors, while the residential real estate stays in the realm of Romanian capital. However, in the case of larger residential developments, also we have international investors in this sector as well. So we started to focus on that by our analysis, and also by, I mean, in our actions, public actions that we made. Because we yearly commemorate the eviction from 2010, and we are not messaging only around anti-eviction, but also about how the urban development is created circumstances which expand the effects of housing crisis beyond the very poor. Right, so already the low middle class is affected, and urban development, the way in which urbanism and real estate development monopolizes the housing market, actually has a big responsibility in this. So in our last actions, we speak about and call about the accountability of both the state and the capital in ways how they together actually create the housing crisis against which one should claim demands. And these demands shouldn't be only, so to speak, not only, not only because they are, every demand related to housing is very hard to imagine that it will be successful. But for us, this is a concern. So how, yeah, again, when we realize that housing is so central to capitalism and the housing regime, as it is, we realize that it's not enough to target immediate demands, but we have to be able to define long-term goals in this matter, and therefore. Our last actions, which we organized together with Grupul de Acțiune Socialistă, that has a group in Cluj also, So we organized together protests last year and even in 2020, 22, 23. Yeah, in these actions, we tried to articulate the revolt and demands around how the capital monopolizes the logic and trends of urban development and how this affects everybody from the city.
Annika, can you draw your comments to a close, please?
Yeah. I'm approaching to the end. Thank you. So, for example, we demand that 50% of the total housing stock should be in public ownership. Why 50%? Again, many people say this is unrealistic. Obviously, it's unrealistic, but no demands are realistic actually in capitalism. So therefore, 50%. Why? Because you need to have a significant amount of public housing in order to also have effect on the market. So to extract as much housing units as you can from the influence of the housing market. Then we targeted the real estate developers. So basically, obviously, the question how to increase the public housing stock. For example, if the private developers are the only ones who construct and who have land because all the public land was privatized, or all the former industrial platforms were privatized and bankrupted. So they basically regenerate those platforms. So if they are the only ones who produce housing, then expropriation would be a solution for increasing public housing. So no, if the state says, I cannot construct, I'm not able, all this discourse about the weakness of state when it has to do something for public benefit. The state always is weak when it has to do something for public benefit, but it's strong when it has to support the capital. So we say 25% of what real estate developers produce should be expropriated, becoming the entering into the ownership of the municipality and rented out as a public housing, which we also add should be democratically organized and administered by the tenants. So not only the municipality, but tenants unions should also have a say on how this public housing stock is administered. Okay, so we focus on this. Obviously, the control of private rent would be also continuously an important demand. So the regulation of the market, to an extent or another. And yeah, several other demands, which, for example, claim that urbanism should regain its old public function, the students, because, for example, Cluj is a university town, so very much relies also its economy on students, and there are no public dormitories, and that also has an input into sustaining the private rental sector. Okay, so maybe this is enough, Nikos. Thank you for all of you listening. Yeah. So
thank you. Thank
I
you,
am
Annika,
looking, and we are looking for comments, discussions. There are other Romanian colleagues here and also from Cluj who could participate. Yeah.
Thank you, Annika, very much for this very interesting introduction. The process followed in WIN meetings is that there are questions or comments, and then you will have time in the end to sum up and answer to some questions that may exist. So I think we should open the floor to comments, questions, or contributions by comrades. Please raise your hand or write something in the chat if you want to speak. Yes, David. You should unmute, David.
Annika, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, please discipline me. But it was a very worthwhile discussion, and it covered so many of the points which are central in the housing crisis internationally. Take us back to the writing of Engels on the housing question, where he was arguing that it is impossible under capitalism for the working class to have decent, healthy housing, and that the building societies, the idea that you could have cooperatives and collect money, was actually not a solution under capitalism. At the same time, I want to raise a question which comes very much from South Africa as well, where we have very oppressed layers, is that most of the working class wants to own their own house because they have been denied ownership, they've been denied a place in the city, and so they want to be able to own the house and have that document to state that they are permanent. And that goes straight on to the next question I'd raise. The second point I'd raise is that the land question is so tied up with the housing question. It's virtually one and the same thing from the working class's point of view. So that land, if I could give the example in South Africa and also in Namibia and in all the colonized world, has been held by the colonizers, by white people. And that still remains the basic geography of, in Europe, I imagine it just is the rich. And that is the geography. In other words, the poor areas are going to be those which are geographically badly sited, so you get flooding and you can get your houses swept away. And the high rising places are where there's fresh air and wind, and that's where the rich, position themselves. And if I could mention, in South Africa, the land ownership is virtually unchanged in geographically, so that racial capitalism marks out exactly where you will find people, and not only where you'll find people, but where you'll find, let's say, the most oppressed layers among would be those in the worst conditions, struggling for survival. So what I'm interested to look at this in terms of, you've mentioned a bit the informal settlements. In South Africa, we call them shacklands, and that is square kilometers of shacks, which the workers have to put up themselves from the bits and pieces that they can find, plastic or wood or anything of that kind, to shelter them, against, what's outside, at least then. And then you have shack lords as well. Some of those you would have to pay rent, in that way. Then looking to the solution, of the problem, in post-apartheid South Africa, we've had massive contracts for massive corporations to go and build very quick housing, which is basically 2 rooms. One room, which is the kitchen and the bathroom, the other room, which is the bedroom, to which you have to add another room for the children. And that is the basic structure of working class housing in South Africa. Very small rooms, which are all made not out of brick, but out of building blocks, where this is, that is called the public housing. In Namibia, there's not even public housing. Now, the question is, what is our policy in relation to public housing? The argument has been that, well, the land must be released. But the land, that's the most difficult question, even in a post-apartheid, is to get that land released, because the municipality doesn't want to let go of it. And the private people want to, owners want to hold on to the land until they can get the highest price ever, for that land. So it takes literally 5-10 years, to be able to release land, which will go for public housing. So the land, we come back again to the land question and to the racial geography and class geography. It's the same thing in Southern Africa, which relates to that. But I'll return again to this question. The aspiration to own a home is very strong among the oppressed, and that is a problem. The other aspiration, sorry, just to end on this point, is to be as closest as possible to the city center, so that people do not want to be placed outside the city perimeter because the costs of transport are enormous out there. And so people would rather live in rubbish heaps in the landfill areas and put up shacks there where no one else wants to build because of the stench of the rubbish, and then rather live there because at least they can get close to where you can get a job, a casual job, which is close to the city. Now, I'm mentioning a number of rather specific things. I apologize for not responding to the specific points in Romania, which are very interesting. But, I hope this leads on to some discussion about how the universal issues, which are related to housing question. But thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Finn, and then Matthew.
Comrades, I want to thank Annika for a very, very interesting open contribution. And I want to talk a bit about her experience here in Ireland and how it's very like what you've just been describing, trying to build a campaign, which we're all involved with, and it's quite an effective campaign. But the issues that you mentioned, institutional investors and rising rents, that's a central issue here in Ireland at the moment. Institutional investors, which often come from abroad, from America and other countries, buy up entire estates of houses, even before they're completed. And the entire estate then belongs to the institutional investor, who then rents out the property. Blocks of flats have been taken over also by institutional investors. So the issues are very, very similar. The average rent in Dublin per month at the moment is €1,400, and people can't afford that. The average cost of buying a house is €400,000, which people can't afford either, particularly younger people. On average wages, it's beyond reach. It can't be done. Now, the thing I want to refer to next is there's a very good record of public house building in Ireland, also in the UK. Some very, very good estates, very extensive building programs by municipalities and agencies have been created in Ireland and also in Britain. But they were all sold. They were all sold off. And the property which was owned by the municipality or by government agencies was given sometimes to the person living there, but also sold off in the private market as well. Now, I'm not sure there's the same kind of psychology here as in every other country. The reason why people want to buy homes here is because of the security. There is no security in the private rental sector. And the only way to have that security is to own the home yourself. But there was a time when these estates that were being built by municipalities provided that security. And the rent was what's called differential rent, which was linked to the income in the household. And people were quite content to live in property they didn't own, and the knowledge that the security of tenure that went with that was adequate. Why would you want to spend money buying a house if you were properly catered for in a good, decent estate? Now, there were garden estates and very attractive estates built by the municipalities here. And what happened was that the agency or the municipality hired the builder and hired the various skilled trades to build the houses, but the house and the estate belonged to the municipality. What's changed now is that the private developer owns the property and makes the decisions about tenancies and so on. Now, there are two agencies involved in house building which are parasitic and should be got rid of. The developer, for example. What the developer does is the developer goes into a bank, borrows some money, then with that money, then hires a building contractor, buys the land, has the house constructed involving skilled labor. By the way, the developer does nothing. The developer doesn't lay a block, doesn't set the electrical systems in, doesn't create the plumbing, doesn't dig the foundations, doesn't paint the property, doesn't even market the property. They hire bodies to do that. Now, a public body can do all of that. The developer is parasitic. The role of developer should be abolished. There should be no such concept in modern society as what's now known as a developer. It's a parasite. The land question is more complex. 1/2 of the cost of buying a new house now in Ireland, half of it goes to the landlord and the developer, which means that when somebody buys a house here, they're actually buying 2 houses, one for themselves and one for the developer and the landlord that they go off and spend. And the landlord also, that issue can be resolved. The land should be taken from them by decision, by legal decision, and that can be done. There's a provision in Ireland for what's called compulsory purchase, where the land can be taken from the landlord and used for public good, and that's not being availed of. So the way to deal with that is to get rid of these roles, and the property has gone up enormously in price. People who bought property, say 10 years ago, for whatever reason, or owned property for whatever reason, that has maybe gone up tenfold. And that extra money goes to the owner, who has done nothing. They haven't worked overtime. They haven't given up their weekends doing labouring jobs or working in the pub at night. The money flowed to the landlord simply by virtue of ownership, and that needs to change. So the demand should include the abolition of the role of developer and the compulsory seizure of land which is needed for public housing from the landlords. Now, what we have here at the moment, we have a mass campaign built which is called Raise the Roof. It began perhaps 10 or 12 years ago. We were involved through the Dublin Council of Trade Unions, bringing together political parties, NGOs, campaigning groups, community groups, and so on. And arising from that campaign, we then involved the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is now the lead body in this national housing campaign. And the 2 main demands that are being made at the moment, the organisation is now known as Raise the Roof, are that there should be a public house building programme across the country, and that the government should establish a state building company that would build the houses. Now, that's an important demand, because a state building company could insist through the trade union movement on proper conditions, trade union membership, health and safety issues on site. So that's an important demand, the establishment of a state-owned building company. So the developer and the landlord could be got rid of by means of legislative measures. And if the state owned a building company, they could build the houses themselves and not be going cap in hand to the government. On the issue of co-ops, I'm not sure what Engel's position on this. Engels was writing in the middle of the 19th century. Things have changed significantly now. There are a number of successful co-ops which build houses and sell them at the cost of that goes into the actual construction itself. And not only is that a useful way of providing houses, it's also an illustration of what a capitalist system is not essential in the process of home building. And we could emphasize the importance of the co-op. The house that I lived in when I first came to Dublin was a co-op house. It was built by the trade union. The union I was a member of built the houses. They hired the contractor. They built the houses. The houses belonged to the union. And then they allocated them to people who wanted to avail of the offer. So the idea of co-ops is a very useful illustration. And like I mentioned earlier, this issue of ownership is no longer a key question. If there's security of tenure and guaranteed tenure, which can be done under the municipality procedures, then why would somebody go away and try to find €400,000 to buy a house? I mean, if you have a decent place to live and is properly maintained by maintenance services from the municipality, the issue of ownership doesn't arise. The reason it's, South Africa is different. I'm not applying this across every single country. There's different histories. But in Ireland, people were proud of the local authority houses they built, that they lived in. In the UK in particular, there's some beautiful estates built. I've been reading some works on this in recent times. Some beautiful estates constructed by the local authorities right across the country, in London and many, many municipalities. Beautiful areas. And we have them in Ireland, we have them in Dublin. A short walk through the city from the north side to the south side you pass these lovely estates that were built and lovely blocks that were built. They're not all just cheap, loads of concrete thrown together. They're quite attractive buildings. They were done by serious architects who were committed to public service. But they were all sold. So now when you walk past these buildings, they belong to a private owner now. So what was the municipality is now in the hands of private owners. And one of our demands must be
Can
to
you wind
eliminate
up,
and to
please?
abolish private ownership of these estates. I'm sorry, Nicholas, I've gone on too long, but I was inspired by the notion that Anika's experience in Romania is very much like our experience here. And we've managed to build a campaign around the trade unions and so on. And just one final point. A resolution that we agreed on this campaign about housing, about public ownership, about public building, and about land being used for public purposes. That motion was put to Parliament, what's called the Dáil here, and it was passed. So the official government policy in Ireland, as it was passed in Parliament, was written by the campaign around the housing issue like I've just been describing here. Of course, a Dáil or a Parliament motion doesn't compel the government to act on that motion. That's a question of pressure. But it was actually agreed in the House of Parliament to carry out a policy which we actually in the housing campaigns wrote. Thank you for letting me go on, Lucas. I'm sorry for taking so long, but it was a very inspiring and very interesting contribution by Annika.
Yes, I agree. Yes, Matthew, and then if other comrades want to speak, please raise your hands.
Okay. No, I just wanted to really add to what Finn just said, that actually, of course, the other function of property developers is to bribe the planning authority. And then it's actually, a fair part of their expenses is to make sure they can build where they want to by various methods, which are frequently not the places that everybody else wants them to build, but that's not the matter. The other thing, of course, that's happened here, of course, in Britain, has been the use of the methods of handing over public housing to either to sell it off to the tenant, and then of course the tenants will then sell it on, and you wind up with a situation where huge amounts of property is now in the hands of speculative landlords in one way or another, or actually to hand it over to what are termed housing associations, which of course are basically fronts for the banks in reality, and so it works like that. I think the thing I really was interested in is the effect of migration, because obviously what's happened in the former Stalinist countries, of course, is the accession to the EU has allowed a large section of the population to leave, and actually what we're seeing is obviously people moving. In the world now, is of course considerable numbers of people moving around because of the state of the places they live in, and so we got obviously the interesting about Romania, of course, is the actual decline in the population. So you've got people moving for work, allied obviously to very low levels of fertility. So you don't have nearly so many children. So the population has actually declined, and that's also happened in other former Stalinist countries as well. And what we then seen obviously is that you're then seeing obviously replacement by people from further east. So I mean, it'd be interesting to know, what the effect is of what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, you've got huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees in Romania and Poland and elsewhere. So this is it's that movement of people, and that then of course makes it more difficult for people to organise, and also takes out a large chunk of the younger section of the population who are generally more active in any case, and then creates a situation where people moving, working in one place and maybe seeking to buy property in the country they come from, and so on. So it becomes more complex in those terms and more difficult to organise politically. And it'd be interesting to know what the effect of that is. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Ken, and if there are any other comrades want to speak, please raise your hands.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Enrico, for that contribution. I'd be interested to know how widespread your movement is within Romania. I mean, you've mentioned Cluj and Bucharest, but somewhere like Timișoara, for instance, has that been engaged in it? And have your ideas spread, for instance, to Moldova, for example? So I'm just curious as to the spread of this movement that you've described to us. Thank you.
Okay. Now the comment has raised his or her hand, so I can say a few things. I think Annika's contribution was really interesting, and it opened up a number of issues that we should discuss further regarding how to relate the housing issue with the general, in a transitional way, with the general fight against capitalism. I feel that the housing issue can be an issue of international campaigning, since, as it's clear also from this discussion, a lot of problems are common, and there are many similarities in different parts of the world. At the same time, of course, there are differences. For example, in Greece, there are no big developers owning big amounts of flats. So mainly, it's like some people owning one or two houses and renting them out. So the situation with how to deal with that gets more complex. The problem, in Greece, there was there was a big, until the crisis, the debt crisis, there was a big percentage of home ownership, like 85%. So there wasn't a big housing issue, but this changed because of the crisis. Like building activity fell, and people lost their houses. They were evicted. There were foreclosures, and then of course, the problem was also the huge rise in tourism, which led to the so-called gentrification, like whole areas of the big cities being turned to like Airbnbs for tourists, and this raising the prices for locals, which cannot live there and are actually kicked out, not by being evicted, but actually not being able to pay the rent. So, for example, it's quite common in Athens to pay, for people to ask 800 euros for a house with, not a fancy house, like a normal house, and this is more than the minimum wage. So, people get the idea of what is happening, and that also goes for Thessaloniki or some other cities. So there has been a kind of a movement here, not a movement actually. There has been a discussion going around on the need to for tenants to get organized, and actually last week there was a meeting in Thessaloniki for the first tenants union to be created, and I'm raising the idea here because I found it interesting. It's an important method of organizing. I know that in Ireland there is a tenants union. I think it's called CATU, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And I know that this is a tradition also in Sweden, where there were tenants unions. I think that, of course, regarded social housing or of some kind. So I think it's an important issue to raise on whether we can be involved in this kind of campaigns. And then, of course, it's the issue of demands. I mean, David raised some aspect of this, and Annika, of course, mentioned that. So, for example, in Greece, regarding the problem, some years ago, we raised the idea that there should be a kind of like quota of the number of Airbnbs that each neighborhood can take, because if they become all Airbnbs, then the prices go through the roof. Or we even raised the idea that the municipality can create its own like renting system, which someone could go there and rent, and then the profits that come out of this go to public housing projects. And then, of course, it's the issue of raising the idea that the rent must be a kind of like a percentage of the minimum wage. So this is important. So houses are actually affordable for people. I don't, I can't make a big list of demands. I'm raising, these two as examples of discussion, but I think it's important to discuss how to link these the practical activity, building tenant unions or building campaigns with the demands for housing, which can vary from country to country, and linking this issue with the general fight against capitalism. I'll leave it at that. Dominic, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a couple of points, just following on from Finn's thing about municipal or national housing setup with a building organisation. That's what used to happen in England. In Manchester and other cities, you'd have a direct works department. The council would be building it, would be doing the contract for the housing, and the direct works department would be actually building the houses, and after they were built would be carry on maintaining them and so on. And I think one of the big aspects of that, which I think is certainly a problem as far as I can see in England, is the lack of training of building workers that's going on, because the capitalists are not interested in paying for training. All they're interested in is somebody building a house for them, and then they can charge what rent they can get away with. So, and the whole question again was, in those direct works departments, the workers were organised, they were trade unionised, which gave a security as far as they were concerned. I think when it comes to tenants, I think the very basic things that we've got to have, because in this country, and I don't know what it's like in detail, I missed part of the comrade's speech, but there's absolutely no rights as far as tenants are concerned. There's a lot of tenants, and as far as I can see, it seems a fairly common thing, that are on a 6-month rental contract. This is private renting. And after 6 months, the options are usually that the price is going up. Now, if you've got a family with children and they're at a local school, the disruption that's going to flow from that is really bad. So I think with private rented tenants, you've got to start raising the question of tenants' rights. That it's not a question of just a capitalist kicking them out when they suit, that tenants should have a right of permanence in the dwelling that they're in, and that landlords can only exclude them for very serious things, like actually trying to demolish the house or something like that. And I think the other thing is rent controls. That the renting market is based on shortage, and the capitalists permanently guarantee a shortage of housing because they've got control over the land. You've got building firms that have got what they call land banks that they're not building on because they want to feed the housing through, so that you've still got a permanent shortage. You've just got a monopoly in that situation. And the houses most of them are building are not affordable by working class people. And that's not just, if you like, people who are on basic labouring jobs. You're talking of nurses and the like who can't afford to buy houses in this country. So those are a couple of demands I think that I think you've got to take on board. And the whole question is that you should have municipalisation of housing stock. And if private contractors are involved in the building, or if they're not, you should have tenants' organisations and workers' organisations being able to see the books, to see what they're actually spending and what's actually going on. Because I think there's a hell of a lot of fraud going on in the building industry that needs to be sorted out. And I think in Ireland, I think that was, as far as I could gather, was a serious problem. So those are a few small points that I'd raise. But the other thing is, this isn't confined to cities. Small towns and villages, particularly in pretty areas like seaside resorts and nice country areas, are finding a real shortage of houses because you're getting people from the cities who've got the money buying a second home for their holidays and things like that, and the local community can't afford to live there. They've got to move out. So I think, I'm sorry it's a bit bitty, but those are a few things I think need taking up.
Okay, comrade, thanks. Any other comrade wanting to speak? I see some comments from Romania here. I don't know if they wanted to add something on.
So I'm afraid I did not hear you well. So
No, I'm just saying there are some other comments from Romania here. If I'm saying if they want to speak.
yeah, that would be nice.
Or other comrades, if
Mm.
other comrades want to add something. David, yes.
Apologies, comrade. I don't want to come in too much, but a question again about this home ownership. I'm astonished to see that in China, something like 70% of the houses which are occupied by Chinese people are privately owned. And in America, it's 65%. So in other words, most people in America and in China are working class, are ending up in private ownership. Now, Annika, you mentioned the question of putting a demand at least for 50% of housing to be publicly owned or publicly available, publicly owned to be available for rent. And I just wondered if we can think about this because, what is our international position? Now, what position would international socialists take? It seems in the past, as far as I understand, Romania went through a huge wrecking system of wrecking the old cities, demolishing old working class areas and putting up massive flats and buildings. Now, if that was true, I imagine that could have been called public housing. Has there been a massive privatization and has this led to some of the dilemmas that we've been facing? If you could come back on that when you sum up, I'd appreciate.
David, also, I think you want to forward some apologies for today's meeting from a comment from Namibia.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to mention. Sorry, it's one of the leaders of Workers United, a group which has just been formed in Namibia. She's the treasurer, a single mom with children, and she sends her apologies for this discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments by comrades or questions that helping her sum up before we get there? Or any other comrades wanting to share experiences from their countries? Okay. Okay, if not, I propose we go to Annika for the sum up, if there's no other comment wanting to speak.
Okay, so
Okay,
thank you.
Annika.
There were so many challenging questions. I guess there was a common concern across all the comments, additions, which is the diversity of housing regimes across countries. This is something that I learned a lot, not only from my readings, but also due to the fact that I'm a member of the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing and to the City. And actually, as a European Action Coalition, theoretically, we should be able not only to support ourselves mutually, but also to think about some common demands. in what regards housing, at least at the level of Europe, not only EU member states, but larger, in a larger sense. And that's very hard, yes, if not impossible. Yes, this is also maybe because the European Action Coalition, it's not built around political ideology. So you can find there socialists, anarchists, leftists of all kinds, feminists. There is no, how to say, no way to construct, you know, demands around one political ideology that would be shared. But beyond that, the difficulty is about the diversity of housing regimes, the diversity of past housing regimes, of what, for example, social housing and public housing means in different countries. And this is not a semantic meaning, it's a political and economic significance and meaning. And yeah, it's about the possibility to demand something which is common for all the countries is a big question. And again, the question to whom you address your demands. Right, because even if we look at the European Union, its institutions claim that they don't have a say in the member states' housing policy. Housing policy belongs to the sovereignty of member states. Nevertheless, the European Commission has a lot of measures belonging to its economic policies, which has an impact on housing, but an indirect impact. So it would be logic to demand from the European Commission to change its economic policies in a way that would support public interest in the housing sector. But that would mean, you know, rethinking the whole Maastricht Treaty regarding the free movement of capital, the regulation of capital movement across country borders, would mean redefining this stability pact, which we know controls very much how much public fund is spent by member states. Or the competition law. So a lot of basic EU regulations in the sphere of economic sector would be needed to be changed. So therefore I say, even if we know whom we demand at international level, we have to go beyond housing, because there are a lot of, again, measures, policies which indirectly affect housing. But I agree with Nikos and everybody who said, and you even listed a number of demands which can be considered to be put on an international agenda. But I would add that for a socialist standpoint, it would be important to also think about long-term goals. And that's again very difficult, no? Now to balance the reformist immediate demands and the revolutionary long-term goals. How you make an equilibrium between these two sets of thoughts and actions. But in long-term goals, yeah, this would be, I guess, our mission or duty, or how to say, those who assume a socialist standpoint, to think about the socialist long-term goals in terms of how the housing sector could be changed. And this takes me to the issue of home ownership. David came back even twice on that, but also other comrades mentioned it as something very widespread, from US through Europe to China. And we all know that home ownership is a political construct, is a structure of tenure, but it's also an ideology which was pretty much promoted by decision makers exactly to support the private production of private housing, and through that the capital. Nevertheless, I understand totally, because I also hear this here in Romania, that people who are faced with residential insecurity, they consider that home ownership is a way to secure their situation. But actually, that's also the official discourse, you know. You should become a homeowner because then you can control your life. The official discourse obviously is a trap, because if you take a mortgage, you really lose the control on your life and you don't gain more control on it. But going back to those who are insecure in their private rental or maybe even public rental, yeah, the ideal of home ownership seems to be important, and we cannot contest that. So if one wants to articulate working class demands, then has to be aware what the workers want, including those who want home ownership. And this can take us to study more how home ownership functioned in state socialist regime, for example. In Romania too, we had a huge percentage of homeowners at national level. 70% of housing was in so-called personal property. It wasn't called private property. It was proprietate personală, personal property, which the state allowed people to have. It was even a constitutional right. It recognized the right of citizens to have a personal property, for example, a home. And that was why, because the system needed to mobilize all the possible resources in the society to provide homes, you know, for the socialist economic development plans, industrializations, most importantly in the cities. So in a way, homeownership naturalized ever since, but also the public rentalship was considered something very taken for granted or natural. Nobody thought that they will lose their public rental whenever, you know. So yeah, so but I say that maybe when we think about keeping homeownership, because, well, that's in a way logical for many workers, then we should think about models for homeownership that could eliminate the exploitation of homes, right? And in state socialist Romania, that personal property on home was controlled by the state. Obviously, not everybody liked that. I mean, the homeowners probably didn't like that, but the state took care that the personally owned housing units will not be commodified or will not become speculative issue on the socialist market, so to speak. They could be sold, but for example, somebody could own only one property. So, and this limited very much the potential of turning homeownership into speculation on the market. So yeah, so to think about homeownership models, maybe in this sense, it would be important. But I guess, yes, that the alternative, the secure public rental sector, as Finbar said, would be a good alternative, maybe a predominant alternative to the current unsecure private rental sector. How, yeah, then what else here? How to think about, you know, how you mobilize. I mean, how people mobilize actually themselves across their class or beyond their classes. I guess that's, again, a very challenging question, because nowadays working class is very fragmented, right? So in Romania too, having such a high percentage of homeowners, there are many working class people who have a home, who own a home, but they still can be poor, right? They can still have very low income, and unless they sell their home and remain without it, then owning a home for them, it's not a source of wealth, only potentially, theoretically. And it can be passed to the next generation, obviously. But still, what I want to say, the homeowner workers would be very, I don't know, what is your opinion or experience in this, how the homeowner workers could be mobilized for increasing public housing sector. Which would be the arguments for regarding their children, regarding other comrades, regarding social and political solidarity, or what, you know. Then again, so that is what I want to say, that within the working class we have a fragmentation according to people's status on the housing market. So there can be private tenants, public tenants, homeowners, all workers. How do you mobilize them for some common demands? Or, I don't know, maybe for a set of demands which wouldn't be necessarily the same, but could be complementary, I am thinking. And in this sense, it's very important also, I guess, in terms of mobilization, to connect to trade unions. We also tried that. Yeah, it was, sorry, I forgot the name. Ken, yeah, asked about Timișoara or other regions from Romania. In Timișoara, there was also active an informal group. They were called Right to the City group. And with them and with the Bucharest Common Front for Housing Rights and Social Housing from Cluj and two Roma organizations, we formed an informal decentralized network, Bloc for Housing, that was called. So we made an attempt to, to address national level decision makers also during the pandemic. And we had some campaign also 1 year before the pandemic, trying to target the trade unions and to discuss with trade union leaders about how housing demands could be integrated into the demands of the labor unions, right? So yeah, so I have this experience, a little bit of that. Like, they were union leaders who considered that they should not consider this as a separate demand. They should demand higher salaries, and if people would have enough salary, they could afford to have their home, whatever type they want. We tried to explain this, systemically speaking, this is not the strongest position. So, but there was some labor union who agreed, to try to combine labor rights with housing rights. Actually, a very socialist demand, because during state socialism, at least in Romania, labor rights and housing rights were very much connected. So this is something that we can also think about, internationally speaking, as well. Yeah, so the question of how we construct the political subject, which is mobilized, and the worker as tenant, or the tenant as worker. So to think about the political subject that can be or could be transformed into revolutionary force in these long-term goals of the internationalist socialist movement. So yeah, another question I wanted to say, Nikos mentioned the case of Greece and the high number of home ownership before the crisis, the 2008-2009 crisis. Yeah, I guess you also mentioned that it's important to go beyond the national level and to see the differences between different regions of the same country. And this is another matter that a socialist ideology and the socialist movement should think about, and that is uneven development. So how uneven development reflects in the housing question. As I tried to say, in Romania, due to this uneven regional territorial development, we have the big cities where there is a housing shortage. There is below 1% social housing stock, again, in public ownership. And we have localities where there are empty homes because people left, because there are no jobs, there is no economic activity there. So the depopulation of particular areas and the overcrowdedness of other areas should be also concerned, because when you mobilize, you have to mobilize across territories, not only across classes. By the way, classes, back to classes, I guess, how do we think, could we think about redefining the distinction between working class, middle class? Would that be a good path to take? Like, all the workers who are considered as middle class, they can be low middle class, they don't own means of production, so they sell their labor force for a job, can have a little bit higher salary, and they have a higher social status and educational background, but still they are the working class. And the way in which capitalism today, at least in Romania, functions is that it puts into contradiction or into competition this middle class with the low income working class people, and somehow due to this, even those low middle class people who are struggling to pay the rent or struggling to pay the mortgage are ashamed to go together with low-income workers demanding rent control or demanding public housing, because the system was smart enough, to associate the need for public housing or rent control with something shameful. And this is, again, I think, something that we can work on, how to change these dominant ideologies and people's mindsets about what is, to be ashamed for, or and it's so stupid, in Cluj also, when you can hear all those popular comments or opinions coming from not so very rich people, or maybe, again, low middle class people, who proudly say that if you cannot pay for the cost in Cluj, you should leave. Because, it would be a matter of proudness that the city is so expensive. So why is that a matter of something that you have to be proud of? Why not access to public housing and affordability of housing should be something that you have to proud of, by the way, your city. So all these urban imaginaries and politics of urbanity could be also on our agenda.
Annika, can you please wind up, because I see
Yes,
there's
yes. So
some comments that want to...
I stop here. Yeah. I like very much, I still mentioned this, the state building companies. I mean, that is also our idea, you know, to reformulate this possibility that the state can have its own companies in construction, for example, and housing can be built without that huge profit that the private developers earned from housing construction, only paying for the cost of labor force and the construction materials. But again, this is something very pro-communist, and our demands are very easily, you know, dismissed. Sorry, okay.
No problem. Just I see three comrades want to like add some sort. I propose, you know, comrades add some short comments, and then if Annika wants to briefly come back, and then we can finish the meeting at well, in 20 minutes. So Carol, want to say something?
Hi, I'll be brief. A couple of things. First of all, our long-term goal is socialism. It's not like our long-term goal is let's figure out how to get permanent housing. Our long-term goal is socialism, which basically means having to overthrow capitalism. In our short-term goals, though, should be, and I agree that we have to push the trade unions to demand not only higher wages so that people could afford rents, but also that there be public housing built for working class people. I mean, the fact that there are 90,000 or more people in New York City, which is where I am, that live on the streets, really says something about the need for public housing. And that's forever growing because there's a lot of migrants that are coming in. And so all of this stuff is connected. You can't separate out what's going on in Latin America and other countries and imperialism with having to build public housing and making sure that you don't pit people against each other, is that there's enough public housing for everybody. I think getting involved in people's mental states and all of that is really a dead end, frankly, and that we have to start raising demands that are going to be talking to the entire working class, not worry about the backward nature of the middle class and, you know, will they come along at some point? They'll come along because they won't have any choice but to come along. But our demands have to be ones that are raised to the working class. And this is what a future socialist society would look like. Lenin, when when the peasants demanded land, I mean, he wanted cooperative, you know, land ownership. But he knew that in order to be able to win over the peasants, he had to distribute the land. And that won over the peasants, but he did say to them, you can't hire anybody on your land. If you can work your own land, fine. But that was a short-term goal. That was not a goal. It was a short-term expedience that he had to you know, develop in order to be able to get to his long-term goal, which is socialism. And so I think that the fact that people want, you know, I didn't realize how many people, you know, had home ownership in the United States, but the fact that there are more people who have home ownership in China really should tell us something about the nature of Chinese society. And that the fact that anybody who wants to call China in any way socialist, state socialist, socialism with Chinese characters, when I think David said something like 70 or 80% of Chinese people, I mean, we live in a capitalist society. Romania is a capitalist society. I would never have characterized, I know that we have a disagreement, state socialism under Stalinism. It's not surprising that everything devolved, and now you have the situation in Romania that you do have, because in fact Stalinism never reached the level of any sort of socialism whatsoever. So our demands have to be posed to the working class. This is the kind of society we need to live in. The working class has to develop its own program. It has to develop a program that demands social from the state. It has to demand, not only higher wages, but building public housing and all the things that working class people need. But that's not the end all. The end all is overthrowing capitalism. And without doing that, then we have all this fragmentation between this group and this group and that group and that group. The working class has to be the leadership of this, and that people, those middle class layers who think somehow or other, even though they're poorer in many circumstances than the working class, and but think that they're superior in some way, will fall behind the stronger class, which is the working class. And we have to stop worrying about fragmenting and this and that and the other thing. We need to have a socialist revolution with the working class in the leadership of that, and with other people supporting the demands that are going to ultimately create a socialist society. Otherwise, we have to worry about this region, this, and that will get us nowhere. Our long-term goal is socialism. How are we going to get there?
Okay, Carol, thanks. So short comments by Dominic and then Finn.
Yeah. There's just a couple of points I wanted to raise, 3 points I wanted to raise. One, this question of the EU. I think you shouldn't be surprised that a capitalist organisation is going to come up with some excuse for not carrying out legal procedures within which are in the interest of the working class. They have no problem about borders and all the rest of it when it comes to the EU laying down laws about what you can do in the interest of capitalism in each country in the EU. They've just got problems when it comes to the interest of workers in the EU. So I think we've got to take that up. And that's part of the struggle, quite honestly, because as I see it, what we're here about is the fact that every problem you see, and certainly this is my view, every problem we see, every major problem we see in the world is caused by capitalism. Is caused by their greed to maximize profit, whether you turn to climate change, to the destruction of the animal world, the fact that people can't live in a decent house. It's down to capitalism. So you can't solve the housing crisis within capitalism, but that doesn't mean to say you can't fight for decent housing within capitalism to expose what the role of the capitalists are. If the capitalists were doing a good job, we wouldn't need to be discussing. The whole point is they're just parasites on society and just need to be removed. And I think that when it comes to the campaign, I think you've got to be quite simple about it, because we can't overthink what we've got to put in a manifesto and have this and that and the other, because we're only a few people. It's the working class who'll decide. So if you get a campaign going, it's the members of the campaign who'll tell you what's needed in housing, because they live in them, because they've got problems with them. So that will come to the fore. Just keep the thing fairly basic, fairly straightforward. I mean, I would think you'd be looking at something like a title of a campaign for decent, affordable housing, and that would encompass what comes up. You can't think of every problem. You face them when you come to them. But the basic thing is the rents, or the mortgage prices the banks are charging, and all that sort of stuff. So you've got to keep it. What we're after is decent housing for the working class, and the working class includes the middle class, because in this country we're having strikes of barristers, strikes of doctors, and all the rest of it. The middle class as Napoleon referred to England as a nation of shopkeepers, the shopkeepers have all been closed down. They all have to go out to work for a living. They now go to supermarkets to buy the goods. And that's the way capitalism is going in every industry, whether it's factories that have lawyers, factories that have accountants in them, and all the rest of it. So don't worry about it. Get down to the basic thing of organising the working class to fight for decent housing at an affordable price. And how you do that is you get around the local housing communities. You've got residents associations, if you've got tenants associations, you get them involved, you've got the trade unions involved, and it means a lot of lead work. And that's where we need people to do it. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. Then Finn.
I'll be brief, comrades. I think it's been a very good discussion, and we don't have to go away. We'd have to go and think more deeply about the questions that have been raised. So I just want to make a comment about this issue about ownership and rental. The key question in this discussion is security. People are entitled to security, to have a lifelong lease for a property if it's rented. And that involves, in terms of purchasing, they will need to facilitate, particularly younger people who want to purchase houses who now can't, through public ownership of the banks, and control over mortgages and control over how the banks use the money available to them to enable people to buy. The trend in Ireland is probably the same internationally now, is to rent rather than buy, and that's because of the cost of purchasing. But there used to be what was called a differential, and rent should be based on the income of the people in the house. There used to be what was called a differential rent system here, where the local authority charged in accordance with the income that was coming in, not the cost of building the house, but the income that was coming into the house. And that lasted for life. And then you were entitled to pass the house on to somebody else in the family, if, again, the social need enabled that to come about. So ownership and rental are not contradictory. You can have a facility to enable people to purchase houses if they choose, and to rent. But the question of the cost of purchase, the key issue there is the cost of building. There's no need for a big landlord charge. There's no need at all for the developer to extract income from it. The cost of building the house should be the cost of purchasing the house. The cost of rental should be based on the income. And even though the house belongs to a public authority, the rent is such that it's security for life. You have a lifelong lease, so they're not contradictory. So we're not saying people shouldn't own their houses. If they wish to purchase a house, it should be facilitated in that, and that means control of the banking system. If they wish to rent a house, the best option is to have a public body building and renting the property. And that used to be the case. And just one final comment about ownership. Margaret Thatcher introduced quite starkly the question of selling off all the local authority properties across Britain when she became Prime Minister. And her theory was this concept of property owning democracy. That if workers own their houses, they're less likely to become militant and radical, which of course is rubbish, because people become radical because of the conditions of their working experience, not whether or not they own the house. But that was the thinking behind Margaret Thatcher's policy of selling off all the local authority properties. And now we have to put a stop to that. That needs to end. And if the local authorities sell a house, which we wouldn't be opposed to in principle, then they must build another house. If they sell a flat, they must build another flat. So there should be a replacement of public property following sale. What happened in the past was the properties were sold, and now the local authorities have nothing. They don't have any properties to rent to people. So just to conclude with what I began with, security is the main question. People are entitled to lifelong security in their home. Whether that means purchasing a house or renting a house, the consequence must be security for life. That means no evictions. Well, it means that rent has to be affordable, and that'll be controlled by differential rent system. And purchasing a house would be controlled if there was a public banking system rather than private systems which exploit particularly younger workers trying to buy their first home.
Okay, thanks, Finn. Okay, Annika, you wanna shortly come back? We have like something like 5 minutes. You wanna shortly come back in some points, or?
Yeah, thank you. It's a huge responsibility to come back to all these ideas and to be smart and mobilizing at the same time. I would go back to my starting idea, which was acknowledging that housing is a terrain of capital accumulation and relations of exploitation. So in this sense, I also stressed what Dominic mentioned in his last comment, that the current housing crisis cannot be solved within capitalism. And this is the starting point from where all our difficulties as housing movement it is rooted. The question if we can do anything to, as Finbar said, at least increase people's security in terms of housing, whatever forms that would take. I'm sure that it's not the housing movement which will make the socialist revolution. So I was just sketching out some ideas why, for us, when we are thinking about constructing a political solidarity within the working class, we encounter these issues, you know, of fragmentation and of how people's labor position is intersected with their housing status, and this creates a lot of combinations and willingness or not willingness to be together with others for housing related claims. But again, I'm very much convinced that the housing movements can be only a very, very small part of larger societal initiatives and mass organizing for socialism as alternative to capitalism. And besides that, there are many housing movements which don't define this goal for themselves. So in a way, I would say, back to Finbar, maybe, that there are many housing grassroots groups which react always to what is happening at the grassroots and demand, they demand what actually people whom they work with demand. So they don't have some long-term goal in this sense or political target, but reacts to the now and here stuff. But besides that, I'm sure that an internationalist socialist organizing should put on its agenda housing, and with this, I guess I'm ending, to try to, to do this, not only try to formulate immediate demands in a way that would not be in contradiction with the long-term goals. Theoretically. Concretely, I'm sure this is very, very difficult. And you know, you as an activist, and people as activists need some sorts of successes, small successes, because otherwise, you know, it's very hard to continue and repeat and react always against the system and revolt without any small sign of success. So strategically speaking, it's important to have demands which you can hope that they can be accomplished tomorrow and still work for long-term goals. But again, these two sets of demands shouldn't be contradictory, because otherwise we wouldn't be socialists, no. But don't ask me how you can balance these two types of strategizing. Yeah, and yeah, I guess this is where I would like to end.
Okay, thank you very much, Annika, for this. I think it was a very good discussions. We learned a lot about housing movement in Romania, but the general discussion about housing is important. And just to say that the way to link everyday struggles with the struggle for socialism is like an everyday painstaking task that we don't have answers to, but we try to do it through the Marxist method. So I think we should close this Workers International Network meeting today. I think it was really good. Just to announce that next meeting will be on the result of the elections in Taiwan, which is really important as it has become a focal point of the US-China battle for world domination. We will have comrades from Taiwan leading off on this and presenting the situation from the ground. So I think it's really important. So I think we're closing the meeting now, comrades. Thanks, Annika, and thanks for all the comrades that are here. Bye.
Thank you.
Keep in touch. Bye.